Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to show you 5 different ways to paint snowy trees in watercolor without using white paint. For this project you will need a piece of watercolor paper. I'm using 140-pound cold press cotton watercolor paper, and then you'll also need a variety of blues and greens to paint the tree. So I'm using cerulean, ultramarine blue, indigo, and sap green today. And the only brush I'll be using for all 5 techniques is my size 4 round brush from Princeton. So the first way to paint a watercolor snowy tree is by using the negative painting technique. So negative painting in reference to watercolor is where we keep our lighter areas light by actually painting around it. So if you need to visually see the snow clumps as you paint the pine needles or the leaves underneath, then I would suggest sketching out some snow clumps before you go in with your green. So as we negative paint, we're able to very distinctly keep the white of the paper for the snow. So this gives us a lot of control over how the snow is colored, where the snow is placed, but it can be a little bit tricky to imagine where the snow clumps are as you're sketching them. And so sometimes I like this technique. It gives me great results if I'm wanting something very specific, but it also doesn't quite give me that loose watercolor feel. So for all 5 of these techniques, you will see the pros and cons of each one. Another pro of this technique is it's not wet into wet, and sometimes for beginners, wet into wet can be very intimidating. So if you're wanting to create snow with your trees, this is a great way to get started and get a feel for it. So I always recommend looking at a reference photo, seeing how the snow is laid on a tree, and then trying to mimic those shapes before you go in with your greenery to create the branches underneath. So this is sap green, and I'm also using a bit of indigo to create texture and color underneath my snow clumps in the form of the tree. Don't forget to make the branches kind of flare out and not make it feel too thick in the middle, not like a perfect triangle. We want some gaps and shape inside the tree as well. And then once your greenery is fully completely dry, I'm using my hair dryer, but you can use anything to let it dry or just let it dry yourself by waiting. Then I go in with some very light cerulean to give a bit of color and shadow to the snow, because remember, if you want dimension in your snow, snow reflects a lot of the colors around it, and typically in the winter those are cool tones. You can also reflect some of the green tones back, or if you have a purple sunset, you could do that too. So that is technique number 1, negative. Now let's move on to technique number 2, and that's salt. And you can see very quickly that I'm moving really quickly. This is a wash of cerulean. You can tell I'm using a lot of this color, and that's because when you use salt, you need quite a bit of pigment for the salt to push it away. So I'm using a lot of salt, a lot of pigment. I'm making this rough outline of a tree. So think of a silhouette. You want the texture coming out, you want the overall tapered shape, but you don't have any gaps. It's all just one solid color, and I need to move quickly because I need all of my tree to still be wet when I go in and add the salt. So this is kosher table salt, nothing too special, and we're going to let that dry. You can watch it dry in real time as we continue to paint, and we'll come back to it after that's completely dry. I wouldn't recommend using a hairdryer because it kind of messes with the salt technique. The next snowy tree technique is using lifting. So here I have a mixture of sap green and cerulean because I want a light greenish blue. I'm making these random strokes kind of floating in the air where I think snow would be on top of them. And then after I paint a few, because we want to do this in sections, I'm going to use clean water to lift some of that pigment out of those little textured strokes to create the shape of a snow clump that is nicely, naturally colored. So I love this technique if I'm painting a branch with a bird on it and I just need a quick branch with snow. I'll paint a few textured pine needles, really kind of short, and then I use clean water to lift some of that color out, and I make this circular shape to give me a snow clump feel. So this one can be tricky because once again, you need to kind of picture where the snow is going to be as you're kind of placing these textured branches out in thin air. They're kind of floating out there. Once again, just look at your reference photo and see where the green is. So sometimes we look at our reference photos and we're looking at where is the snow, but kind of squint your eyes and see where are the dark colors, where is the green. Place those shapes in the areas that you think look like the reference photo, and then we'll scrub out some interesting textures to create snow. So you can see it makes this beautiful, light, very snowy tree, and we have these really light branches underneath. So now we can go in with more of a intense sap green and create more of a pine needle shape underneath where we've already created it. So something that's nice about this is we're not really thinking beforehand, it's more in the moment. But then after we have our light snow formation from the lifting technique, we can go and really make sure we're defining these branches and these areas of snow with our sap green color. So to me, this technique makes the snow look very natural because it has such a light color, and sometimes getting a light value in your first color placement can be very tricky. So if you're just lifting color to create color in the snow, it tends to be a little more natural. But the other thing that can be hard, especially for beginners, is that you need to move quickly and work in sections so that the pine needles are still wet when you're lifting. Otherwise, you'll have a hard time lifting that color out. So just work in smaller sections. Once all of your greenery is completely dry, I added a bit of indigo into my greenery as well, just underneath the snow clumps for a bit of shadow. Then you can go in and add ultramarine blue or cerulean for light color and shadows. For me, my light source is going to be coming from the right, so I've got more of my shadowy colors on my snow clumps on the left side. So making sure that your snow clumps have color and shadow and dimension is really going to take all of your snowy trees to the next level. Now, if your tree ends up a little bit gappy like this one did, you can add a trunk that is showing through. So I have mixed magenta into my bluish green mixture I had on my palette with a little bit of yellow to get a nice brown, but you can use any brown that you want. Just add a little bit of this color peeking out between the branches to finish the look. So that was our lifting technique, and now we're going to move on to blue tree. I didn't know what else to call this, but this is where you're actually painting the snow in a light blue color first. So we're not painting it blue like the salt tree because we don't want a total silhouette. What we want is we want to think about how the branches are forming, leaving a little bit of gaps. It's almost as if you're painting the tree, but you're painting it the snow color without a ton of the pine needle texture detail. I also like to do this in sections. You can see I did the top section a more light cerulean wash, and then while it was still wet, I dropped in some indigo on the left side to give myself some shadows that were really natural, a more wet into wet shadow. And then I continue on with the second half of the tree, scrubbing in this tree shape and texture with this light cerulean color. And then very quickly, while it's still wet, I'm going to tap in more of my indigo wash onto the left side. So I really love this technique because I enjoy wet into wet. I love the natural look of this, and I also love that I'm painting the tree but in the snow color, and I'll show you why that matters in just a minute. So once we have focused on adding some of those wet into wet shadows, we're going to make sure it is completely dry before we add our greenery. Now, as I dip into my sap green, because I have formed the whole tree, the branches and everything with this light snowy color, when I go to add the greenery, I am adding the greenery in tiny strokes just underneath the snow or on the snow. So we don't want to fill in any of those gaps because remember, the whole thing that we painted is the whole branch. So it includes the greenery and the snow. So we're using the greenery to negatively paint the snow now on top of where we have already given the branch. So I love using this technique when the snow is very heavy on the tree and you need a lot of snow, because you just can take the greenery and do very tiny strokes underneath and help define the shape of your snow clumps with this green color, which is one of my favorite parts about painting snowy trees in general. The deep contrast of the green, the sap green, with your lighter cerulean snow is such a beautiful contrast that you can see your tree come to life pretty quickly. I had a bit of a weird moment in the center of the tree, and so I just lifted some of it out with water, tapped it on my paper towel, and then I'm just going to kind of fix it by adding more greenery in certain areas. So once again, look at a reference photo. Some areas of the tree are thicker with greenery showing, so you can see more of the greenery and less snow. So there's a lot of variation you can do with all of these trees, and they don't have to be perfect. They can have more gaps, they can be fuller, but we're trying to get that feeling of texture, movement, and leaving enough snow that it looks very natural. Once you have added all of your greenery, then you can once again add in cerulean or ultramarine blue or even indigo for your shadows, kind of scrub in those colors on the snow clumps to make them come to life. So this is actually one of my favorite ways to paint snowy trees. But the next one, which I have called water blobs, I know it's very original, actually surprised me and might be my new favorite. So I am placing very random large blobs of clean water on my paper, and you can see a side angle here and how blobby it is. It is not damp. I'm very much so leaning into the blobs. There's lots of gaps. We don't want it to be a silhouette like the salt tree. It's the general rough idea of a tree and where the snow might be. Before those blobs have dried, while they're still very blobby, we're going to add color. Light blues, maybe even a bit of green. My sap green is just very spreading, and so I quickly went into more of my cerulean. And we're going to add this color just underneath the blobs to represent the color of the tree or the branches or the pine needles. And then as the color spreads up into the blobs, that will give the color of the snow clumps. And I just love how much of a watercolory feel this is. If you have a harder time with control, like you need to control your watercolor, this one is not for you. It pretty much did whatever it wanted. I was just trying to add color and then see what happens if I let it dry. So this is not the final version of the tree. We're still working on the snow clumps, but now we're going to let that dry while we work on the salt. And I cannot wait to show you how that one finished, because I think the far right one ended up being my very favorite. So with the salt technique, once it has completely dried, you can just remove the salt with your finger. It needs to be completely dry because the salt pulls in the pigment and pushes it out, and so it can be very wet and you can streak your painting if you remove the salt too early. So now that I have this giant salty silhouette, the salt created this lovely crystally pattern that looks way cool for snow. Because it is such a giant thick silhouette though, I have to be very imaginative about where I'm putting my green to negatively paint the snow clumps. So we didn't form any snow clumps before we started, and now we are forming them here by adding the greenery. And man, this one always turns out better than I think it will, because you're painting on top of this giant textured blob. But I love how intensely blue this looks. This would be perfect for a very icy scene that you wanted to paint, or if the tree was very much in shadow and you needed it to be very dark. So then once you put all of your greenery, you can fiddle with the edges, make sure you have more of that texture floating out. You can add indigo once again, just under the snow clumps for some of that shadow. And then I like the way all of the blue looked. I didn't feel the need to add more shadow to the snow clumps, but you always can. Back to the one on the right, even after painting the salt tree, there was still a lot of water on the blob tree. And so I did need to pull out my blow dryer to dry it. Just be careful. You can see I have a little bit of a stream of water that tried to escape there. And this is very similar to how we approached the blue tree, where we can see some of the gaps and we're not trying to fill it in too much. We're painting just underneath the snow to create contrast and texture. But I love that the snow already has so much color and so much depth, and it feels like the snow clumps and the shape of the tree formed really naturally, which can really be the hardest part, is to paint a snowy tree naturally because we're thinking so much about the snow and how it's forming and where it's sitting and what colors that it's going to be. So I found that this blob tree helped me let go of the snow and then made a more natural shape for me to then add some of this greenery in. And this one ended up being my favorite. What do you think? I would love to know in the comments below which one ended up being your favorite. Again, this was sap green to define the branches, and then I went in with some indigo to give shadow underneath the snow clumps, and a little bit of cerulean on the snow clumps themselves for some shadow. But this one didn't need a ton. I just wanted a bit more of a shadow color since most of the color was pretty even. And with that, we have completed 5 different ways to paint snowy trees in watercolor without using any white paint. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please let me know if you have any questions down below, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys.